Welcome everyone to the second webinar in Sustainable Conservation's Watershed Moment webinar series. Thank you all for joining us today, and also to our generous sponsors, Environmental Science Associates, Holland and Knight, and Spotswood Estate Vineyard and Winery. Thank you for supporting our 2023 webinar series and for sharing Sustainable Conservation's vision of stewarding our most precious natural resources for all Californians. My name is Stephanie Falzone, Senior Project Manager on the Accelerating Restoration team. And before I introduce the topic of this webinar and our special guests, I want to give some background on sustainable conservation. For those of you who don't know us, sustainable conservation advances the collaborative stewardship of California's land, air, and water for the benefit of nature and people. All of Sustainable Conservation's programs advance water solutions in California, which is why our three-part fall webinar series, Our Watershed Moment, explores how we can bolster climate resilience and ensure reliable irrigation supplies for farming, sufficient flows in rivers for fish and wildlife, and clean and reliable water for communities. Our first webinar focused on multi-benefit recharge, and our next webinar will focus on water for communities. Today, we'll be discussing habitat restoration and stream flow enhancement with some close partners of Sustainable Conservation's Accelerating Restoration program. And this program for many years has been working to incentivize and speed the pace of restoration by making it easier for project proponents to get through the permitting and regulatory review process by creating expedited alternative pathways for restoration. The reason this is important is because the major laws set up to protect the environment, while essential, unfortunately, do not provide a separate process for advancing beneficial projects that fix environmental problems. And without alternative pathways, restoration projects have to go through the same regulatory process that development projects do. It can often be more difficult, even more difficult, because you're working in the habitat of sensitive species. So it can be very expensive, lengthy, and an onerous process, and sometimes a major disincentive to getting this important work done. So Sustainable Conservation has been partnering and collaborating with state and federal agencies as a technical partner to help create separate regulatory pathways that both meet environmental mandates and efficiently move restoration forward. A little over a year ago, we reached a major milestone in doing that through a collaborative effort between the Army Corps of Engineers, NOAA Restoration Center, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the State Water Resources Control Board, with input from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and restoration project proponents. Two new statewide alternative permitting pathways were approved in August of 2022. So both the State Water Resources Control Board and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service issued statewide programmatic or pre-written authorizations with all of the conditions spelled out up front. They did this for 10 types of commonly implemented aquatic restoration projects. Things like improvements to streams for fish passage, floodplain and wetlands restoration, as well as water conservation projects for enhancement of fish and wildlife habitat, which is what we'll be talking about today. And one of my favorite things about my job is tracking the restoration projects that use those new statewide authorizations, as well as the whole suite of efficient permitting pathways that we and our partners have worked together to put in place. And getting to read about those projects that agency partners fund and permit, and that our NGO partners, like the ones we have here today, implement. And we really like to feature these projects on our new Accelerating Restoration website. That's a great resource for people who are trying to get their projects permitted and want to see example projects. And we also like to feature them on our Sustainable Conservation blog. So subscribe to our email list to get those updates. We've got another blog featuring a restoration project coming up pretty soon. So before we introduce you to our panelists, we'd like to get to know our audience a bit better. We have 3 questions for you, so be sure to scroll down to see all of them. And if you don't see your answer reflected, please feel free to put your answers in the chat. So first one is, where are you located? I am currently located in the Bay Area, although my background is in Yosemite. And then your affiliation, seeing a lot of folks from government, nonprofit. And the third question about your level of knowledge about restoration projects that involve stream flow enhancement for habitat. So we'll just give people a minute or two to respond to the survey. Okay, that's looking pretty good. I'm not seeing too many more answers come in. So looks like we have quite a spread of people, a lot from the Bay Area, Sacramento Valley, but from all over. A lot from government and nonprofit, but a few others. And a lot of beginner and average level of knowledge. So I'm really glad that we're doing this webinar today so we can all learn more about this topic. Okay, so moving on from our poll, I'm excited to introduce our three panelists so we can have you all come on screen. We'll start with Kelix Nelson, who is Executive Director of San Mateo Resource Conservation District. She's also on the steering committee of the California Landscape Stewardship Network and is involved with the California Association of Resource Conservation Districts. She served as the executive director of the RCD since 2006 and is a longtime partner of sustainable conservation. I consider San Mateo RCD to be a programmatic permit power user. And it blows my mind every time I hear Kelix talk about all the different work they do, read about it and get their updates. It's just amazing. And then from another organization that does a lot of restoration projects and has used programmatic pathways like the Habitat Restoration and Enhancement Act many times, we have Troy Cameron, a recent addition to Trout Unlimited's conservation hydrology program. As an associate scientist, he helps to run a large network of stream gauges located in salmon and steelhead-bearing tributaries throughout coastal California. Troy also brings his fisheries monitoring experience to the program and now conducts snorkel surveys for juvenile salmonids in project streams. And last but not least, from an agency that Sustainable Conservation has been collaborating with for quite some time, we have Pete McHugh, a senior environmental scientist at the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, also known as CDFW. He has more than 20 years of experience in fisheries management, habitat assessment and modeling, and environmental permitting, with much of his work focusing on native fish conservation. He's worked as a senior environmental scientist with CDFW, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, since 2019 and currently leads the Bay Delta region's Cutting the Green Tape unit. Pete and his team provide restoration permitting and grant support to projects in the region's 13 counties. So thank you all for being with us today. And we'll start by asking each of you to talk more about the work you're doing. So Kelix, I know the RCD does a lot of different things. Could you start by talking about what an RCD is and talk about your work?
Sure. RCDs, I always say RCDs are the best form of local government you've never heard of. So RCDs are special districts. We are created under state legislation, and we exist in county by county for most of the counties in California. And basically our mandate is to help people help the land and also help people by helping the land. So we provide non-regulatory assistance, voluntary for voluntary conservation typically, and often work very, very closely with our agricultural community at the intersection of conservation and agricultural production, similar to the way, to the values at least that sustainable conservation has around that.
Great. And then Troy, if you could start by explaining what is the Conservation Hydrology Program at Trout Unlimited, and what does it do, and talk more about your work.
Sure. Yeah. So the Conservation Hydrology Program is really pretty unique. It's about 7 or 8 years old at this point, and we're kind of nestled under the California program at TU. We're based in Emeryville in the East Bay, but we work pretty extensively along the California coast from Santa Cruz in the south up to Mendocino and the Eel River Basin in the north. But we've also been expanding into the Sierra Nevadas as well lately. But basically, we run a stream flow gauge network, about 70 sites at the moment. 10 of those are Sierras, the rest are coastal. Essentially, we're trying to fill this data gap that exists in our smaller tributary streams, where salmon and steelhead actually complete their life cycles. So people think about stream flow gauges, they probably think about the USGS and the large network that they run. Those are great references to have, but they don't really characterize some of our small streams and where really the action's happening for fish and people as well in our rural communities. So we focus on providing that information. We visit our sites once a month. We take discharge measurements, staff plate readings, that sort of thing, download data. We start to build rating curves, establishing relationships between stream flow level, stage, as well as discharge, and get some continuous hydrographs. That's sort of our bread and butter work, but we do other things like groundwater monitoring to see what our underground storage is doing. We will do wet-dry mapping, which are hiking surveys to map where there's the presence of continuous, presence or absence of continuous surface stream flow, which goes a long way towards really characterizing the habitat that's available to our fish. We also do GIS analysis for things like water availability, human water use demand. And then, as kind of mentioned in my bio, we started adding snorkel surveys to really see what's going on with our fish populations in the stream. We're really only a small program, though. There's 4 full-time staff. TU is a large entity, but our program is really quite small, actually. And we're, as I mentioned, spread pretty thin over a large geographic range. We rely on some on-call help. So shout out Philip Wassam here. But also our seasonal interns to get through our pretty heavy field workloads. But I will say our work is always done in partnership. We don't really do this alone in a vacuum. So a lot of our partners are here on the panel or in the room, I'm sure. RCDs, CDFW, NOAA, California Trout, Nature Conservancy, all those folks who do a lot more on the ground work with restoration. We kind of provide that glue, that data about what's actually happening with the water in the stream and whether these projects are working or whether there are opportunities. And I think beyond that, I think we are, I don't know if I mentioned this, but we're the largest non-governmental gauge network in the state, maybe beyond. So pretty proud of that. But yeah, I think that sums it up.
Yeah, that's a lot of work. And we'll talk more about partnership. But another thing I noticed when I read about projects is there's always quite a list of partners. It's really never just one organization doing a lot of these things. So yeah, having those partners is key. Now, Pete, if you could explain kind of the role of the CDFW with these types of projects and the role that you play specifically.
Yeah, sure. So sort of starting kind of generally kind of on the ground, the department is, heavily engaged in actions involving fish during water stress times or in water stress locations. So, whether this is fish population monitoring, fish rescues, collecting the sort of data that helps inform projects that would be beneficial to fish in the future. Beyond that, we play an important, I think, granting and project partner role for facilitating water enhancement projects and projects that help fish persist through tough flow conditions and drought type situations. So, this is your sort of the more traditional or obvious project. So say a project that takes diversion offline and helps storage during the wet season, leaving flows in the stream during dry season, to projects that are maybe not immediately obvious as flow beneficial, but confer resilience to populations during water stress periods. So barrier removal, riparian shading, moderates temperatures. These are projects that really are important. While maybe not adding water, they do allow fish to do well through those periods. So that's sort of on the granting and funding side. We also partner on projects and help support voluntary pursuits for flow enhancement through our voluntary drought initiative program, which we worked with NOAA on over the last couple of drought cycles. And then beyond that, we also play a regulatory function. Foremost, CDFW does not regulate water rights. We do review and comment on petitions that change water rights, be they beneficial for a flow enhancement or potentially adverse. In that same space, we also play a technical support role through our in-stream flow program, conducting the sort of field assessments that would inform conditions for in-stream flows that would be protective. And then projects that might require modification to the streams or floodplains to be implemented, we might play a role through our lake and stream bed alteration permitting or California Endangered Species Act permitting. And now we are also able to support these projects with a new CEQA exemption tool, which can be beneficial for flow projects that need a CEQA compliance mechanism. And I'll just add also that as was alluded to sort of in the recent few years, we've instituted a program to help facilitate more expedited execution of those regulatory pathways through our Cutting the Green Tape program. And so my role specifically, I'm really involved in kind of those last two areas, sort of the granting and project management, administration, and then on the regulatory side, being housed in our Bay Delta region's Cutting the Green Tape program. And that more or less sums up the CDFW role and where I fall out specifically.
Quite a lot of things. I do love the Cutting Green Tape project map, story map that CDFW put out showing all kinds of projects all over the state is very cool. If we can find that link, we'll put that in the chat. And let's see. So, another thing I was reminded of is that, even though we had a lot of rain this last year, we tend to forget when it rains that the drought, droughts will come again. So it's important that you all are doing this work to prepare for those times. So maybe now, Kellex, can you, talk about at least one example of this kind of project that you do? What it involves, and if it makes sense at this point, talk about how San Mateo and RCD and Trout Unlimited started working together.
Sure.
Just to paint more of a picture for people.
Yeah. So I think of particular interest for this webinar is our Water for Farms, Fish, and People program. As the name implies, it's about water for farms, fish, and people. And so this is an effort to try to balance some of the competing demands on very limited, particularly surface water resources. In coastal San Mateo County in particular, there's no snowpack, there's no, a lot of the area that we're serving, there's no irrigation district or utility. It's really just everybody has their straw in the creek. And so there's real need for agricultural production. It's part of the economy, the character, the culture, our food security, and the amount of water in the creek can be a real limiting factor for Central Coast coho salmon and steelhead trout. And so we needed to find ways to meet both of those needs. And a lot of that has to do with, really, there's three prongs to the program: conserving water, strategically managing water, and storing water at critical times. And so we do this with domestic users of water as well as agricultural, but focusing on the farms for a moment, what that might look like is helping a farmer overhaul their irrigation infrastructure to be more efficient, and then giving them maybe a different type of pump or system so that they can draw more slowly from the creek, so that they have less of an impact at any given moment, and then giving them adequate storage, a pond or a small reservoir, so that they can divert from the creek during times when water is high, store it, and then irrigate from that stored water when the creek is low. And then this has the mutual benefit of giving water security for the farm, because these farms are needing the water when it's not raining, right? You're not irrigating in the rain. So they're needing the water from the creeks when the creeks are lowest. And when it's driest is when they have the highest demand. So this can give them water security by having a known amount of water that they're going to have available to them during that season, and protect stream flow during the times that are driest. And it's not additional water for them. It still protects the water in the creek, because to do these projects, the landowner enters into what's called a forbearance agreement. It's registered with the deed on the property that says that they will not take additional water, that it gives new restrictions to them in exchange for their certainty about what water resources they will have. And also helps bring them into compliance. So some of them didn't have some of the permits that Pete mentioned, like lake and stream bed alteration agreements and that sort of thing. So that's the program, and we partner extensively with Trout Unlimited on this. Many years ago, we started working with Trout Unlimited about how are we going to approach this work so that we leverage each other, and so that we're not just dividing up the pie, but like bringing different ingredients and making a bigger pie, and getting more conservation done, and having more reach. And so in San Mateo County, we've really developed a lot of fluidity about how we partner together. We write each other into grants. They basically, for all intents and purposes, are our water rights attorney. We confer a lot about the permitting aspect. The RCD tends to have the relationships with the landowners and do the project management for implementation. So we just we meet really regularly and are involved from talking about opportunities to developing concepts to developing projects through permitting and implementation.
Oh, thanks for that, Kellex. Let's see, I'll go to Troy now and see if there's anything else you want to add about that. And then I have kind of another question about, I just want to make sure we hit home why it's so important to do all that measuring that you're doing, putting all those stream gauges out, because it just, you know, might think like, what's stream gauges? Not that exciting. Just like permitting is not that exciting sometimes, but it is. And why it's so important to, do all that measuring and monitoring.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely we appreciate having partners like RCDs, and kind of we've sort of found our groove and our lanes, and we can kind of focus on things that we're best at. And TU, at least the conservation hydrology program, we know monitoring, we do the monitoring. TU generally has a lot more staff, which Kellex alluded to, water rights attorneys, things like that. So we have all these other prongs to our approach as well. So we can offer sort of a multifaceted approach. But we are so partner driven that I find that people think we're pretty easy to work with. We don't have a lot of sort of the red tape that other agencies might have, being an NGO. We're also probably cheaper to work with maybe than some competing for-profit hydrological firms. We share the same values as agencies such as RCD. So I think just from that perspective, that's why people enjoy working with us and keep coming back and piling more work on our plates, frankly. But just to the need for more monitoring, these are also things that have been alluded to, but climate change and just the volatility of things. We're trying to build up these longer term data sets so we can tell which direction things are heading. And just because it rains heavily one winter doesn't mean your underground storage problem is solved and that it's full to the brim again and you can just go like you used to. So yeah, in a lot of these watersheds, there just isn't that availability of information. So someone's got to go out there and collect it. People have a lot of ideas about what's going on in stream, but it's great when we can point to a value and be like, well, this is what it is this year compared to 2015, some really bad drought year, and just have those hard data points to make something out of. And when it comes to decision making too, our program is, non-regulatory, but we can provide that information to make change happen, and also provide information to landowners who might be interested in voluntary changes, to say something like, oh, if you got a $5,000 5,000 gallon storage tank, then you could, improve stream flow in the creek next to your property this much, and that would mean a lot to the fish and that sort of thing.
Stephanie, may I add how we use
Yeah.
that work that they do?
Absolutely.
So when that kind of work that Trout Unlimited is doing helps us identify priority projects, priority locations. It helps us with project design. And it also helps with the permitting of these projects, because often there's a fair bit of information you need to know about, how you'll be protecting, base flows in this season or what have you. So it contributes both at the macro and the micro scale to prioritization and implementation of projects.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, there's so many places you could do projects and, limited, time, energy, funding. That prioritization effort is really important. Let's see, Pete, do you have anything to add on this topic, or, how CDFW is involved in all of this and these kinds of projects, or any examples of successes?
Yeah, well, I would just first I'd echo what Kellex just said in terms of having that information, kind of going into a regulatory proceeding. Super helpful. And of course, when it gets to the water rights side of things, being able to quantify what the change will be under a new water right or a petition to change the water right. Of course, that again, that's not CDFW's lane per se, but we do review and comment on those. And then thinking of it on the granting side, often we do review projects that propose flow improvements, and projects, like everything, are more expensive these days. And so having a sense of what the kind of quantifiable flow improvement you might see for a project can be really helpful when reviewing and approving projects like that. So definitely a really useful sort of synergy with TU collecting that information.
Yeah, that's a great point. Let's see if anyone wants to talk about maybe the different, the role for kind of voluntary conservation and the different ways that, stream flow enhancement and water conservation can be done. I'll leave that open to anyone who wants to touch on that topic.
I'll
add on that.
Take a swing at it. Also kind of addressing part of your question that I didn't answer, Stephanie, kind of on the successes side, sort of just thinking beyond my region, just sort of trends in approaching stream flow enhancement projects, definitely seeing a bit of a change in thinking of what sort of the traditional projects might be, towards kind of the nature-based solutions, or, again, not in the Bay Delta region, but thinking of the Sierra and Southern Cascades, mountain meadow restoration being kind of a big push for kind of preserving and drawing out that snow melt, so you have flows available for more of the low flow season. So that seems to be kind of a success, I would say, in terms of how these projects are unfolding, and kind of approaching them differently, and thinking towards the headwater networks to make those things happen. Yeah, that's positive.
I think there I'll also plug, we featured a Trout Unlimited project that's a lot of Sierra Meadow restoration on our blog. And Troy, if you could talk about it all. It seems like another thing that's important with measuring is measuring how well these restoration projects do at storing more water up in those places, up in the meadows, if you want to talk about that at all.
Yeah, I mean, I will say I wasn't as directly involved with that site, that project, in the Sierras up in the Golden Trout country. But I will say that those sites are really out there, really tough to get to. So there's limited monitoring, because you need to drive several hours down a bumpy Jeep trail to even get there. And so we sort of took the lead on installing some equipment out there and trying a few different things, to like pairing some wildlife cameras with our gauges, to see kind of what the high flows are, because in those mountain meadows, things just kind of spread out. It's not the same geomorphology as we see on the coast, and so it just has unique challenges. but it's really exciting just to get more projects on the ground out there, trying to encourage the water to slow and sink and spread, trying some process-based solutions, beaver dam analogs, things like that. And then, yeah, just the stream flow gauging aspect, just to see exactly how that reacts and how much benefit we can get. And just exciting that people are recognizing the value of these meadow habitats up in the headwaters, and excited to do more of it. And hopefully I'll get to go next season out on a trip out there.
Yeah, I think that was important to highlight that the stream flow enhancement can start way up in the headwaters and then it continues out on the coast. Oh, let's see. I was gonna remind our audience you can put questions in the Q&A box if you have questions as you think of them, and then we'll get to them at the end here. Let's see. If anyone wants to talk about, some of the successes, or if you all have questions for each other, feel free to jump in with those before we maybe see what audience I want to talk about successes, and then how we can get more of this work done. Whoever wants to start with maybe the question one, that first question, or
I can speak to some of ours. I mean, the metrics are kind of complicated and wonky and have all sorts of caveats because these are such site-specific, individualized projects, and the benefits of the creek depend on a lot of different variables, time of year and weather, etc. But I can say that a few outcomes that we've seen, one is that some critical reaches of creeks and in critical times of year, the water has as much as doubled where we're working.
Wow.
And that's really significant. Some areas where in similar conditions, we would have seen them dry up or see fish stranded in pools where there's connectivity between pools. Another thing that we're seeing is it's kind of like elevating the conversation about creek stewardship in our agricultural community, and it's creating some better conditions for collaboration around shared stewardship of creek resources. And I think also this idea that that government and NGOs and public dollars can do something that's good for the environment that isn't harmful to private interests is really important. I think that the kinds of projects that we're doing can demonstrate to people that you don't always have to choose and somebody doesn't always have to lose. And that really invites people in. So what we see often is when we're working with farmers on these projects that have the water storage components, and we have that foot in the door and we built that relationship, they're asking us to come back about wood in the creek and about habitat enhancement and about riparian setbacks. And there are times that we can ask them to give something up and they're willing to, or we now know these water systems so that we can call somebody and ask them not to pump in these conditions. Well, that sort of thing. So like there's a lot of it's like a web that you're starting to weave, and these projects create some sort of critical parts of that web, and then other things come into it as well. That also has benefits for conservation beyond the creeks.
See, that reminded me, if anyone wants to talk about kind of the connection between, the stream flow enhancement and, Pete, those other things we were mentioning, like the shade, riparian, vegetation, and other elements of the habitat that just make it better overall for the fish and other wildlife, and how the stream flow enhancement and restoration, how that all comes together.
Yeah, I mean, just sort of the general notion that water is, fish need water. We can start with that basic fact, right? But the quality of that water is really critical as well. And kind of an interesting development, thinking of a couple of specific projects in our region. I'm actually one in Kellix's backyard in the Pescadero watershed, where there was a project that approached floodplain restoration, in-stream structure placement, concurrent with a flow enhancement project, which was a really neat project to see come together. And I believe there's still some implementation steps happening on that one, but that particular set of circumstances, I think, really, from a regulatory side, provided some unique opportunities to leverage a few different tools. So the CEQA exemption that I referred to earlier on, that kind of, physical habitat restoration and flow enhancement kind of wrapped into a single project was really handy there. And so that's kind of a specific case example, but kind of that general, kind of bigger picture that we really do need to see things together. Obviously, in these worst drought years, just seeing any water is kind of the first precursor when we're actually physically rescuing fish from streams that are drying up. But we have to think beyond that, and just there is water in some years, and we're in good shape. We need to maintain that quality and physical habitat as well.
Stephanie, there was a question in the Q&A box that I answered, but I was being a little cheeky. There's a more complete answer that I could give.
Sure.
Chris, who's on the line with us right now, said, things were pretty difficult, challenging in the community of Pescadero, and how did that change happen? And so for those who aren't familiar, Pescadero is really a great case study in what happens when a community's livelihood and safety and identity is really closely knit with natural resource management. And this is a community where I think there was a lot of concern that they were being asked to do certain things or regulated to do certain things, but other natural resource concerns that they had weren't being addressed. And so there was a lot of either or, a lot of finger pointing, a lot of pitting things against each other. And there was definitely some widely held beliefs that you had to choose between the environment or public protection, particularly when it came to flooding. And so this was one of those times where we had to keep showing up and really authentically do a lot of listening, which, by the way, isn't funded. So I wanted to tie that in with some of the challenges. So the work to build collaborative capacity for landscape scale work, the work to build relationships, to often the work to develop projects or even identify them or have confidence in the community to put projects like this in, is rarely funded and very, very difficult to do without the funding. So I want to put in that plug. So then we needed to have some early wins. We needed to do some listening. We needed funding for that kind of work, which the county largely provided. And we needed to find some wins. And that ties into another one of the things that I think is ahead. Some of the remaining challenges in future work for us is, I think that we're getting better at it, but we still need to figure out how to do multi-benefit work. And so if you're doing any watershed restoration at any scale, it's going to have benefits that are beyond habitat enhancement. And it's probably going to involve something in the built environment, a bridge or a road or something like that. And so I think, and that's what happened in Pescadero. That was the need. There were some needs for addressing things in the human built environment and flooding to the community that were related to watershed process and function. So I do think that that's something that still remains for us to do, because we're at a point where we need to be doing things at a scale that isn't the smaller projects necessarily. We need to be doing landscape scale work. And so I think we need to still figure out how we're going to permit and advance those things as part of habitat restoration. So I try to do two things there, answer that question, but also answer your question about what remains ahead. And then I'm going to throw out another thing that I think remains ahead, where we've made tremendous progress with, Resource Agency and CDFW's Cutting Green Tape initiative, and also with work that's being done by the State Water Resources Control Board, and also some of the programmatic work that's been done by NOAA Fisheries and now U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and of course with sustainable conservation having a hand in almost all of these efforts. And I think that some of the next steps are really around water rights. That water rights still are a significant barrier to getting these projects done. They're not really visibly or palpably on a different path in a way that has quite the on the ground results that we need, so that water rights happen and during the window that you have the grant funding to do the projects. And you have to synchronize everything. You have to synchronize your grant funding window, your permit window, and the water rights window. And also there's like harvests and agricultural production windows and, you know, operational realities. So I do think that that's something else that's still needed.
All righty. Well, I was going to ask about how our work, your work connects with sustainable conservation. Thank you for covering that, Kelix. And Pete, with that project you were talking about with the flow enhancement and the habitat, that is a project that we have on our accelerating restoration website, more focusing on kind of the project proponent to getting the details. And we will have a blog post about that project. And I just got some new photos, kind of some posts, some of the implementation from San Mateo RCD. So we're excited to feature that project. And I thought the same thing when I saw it, that it was really cool that it had flow enhancement with the floodplain restoration, and that it used like the full suite of efficient permitting pathways. You know, there's, you know, not permitting pathways for every single thing, but to see a lot of those things coming together used for that project was very exciting. So we're happy to feature that project. Maybe I'll let either Troy or Cameron talk about, you know, some things, you know, what else would you like to see? You know, how can we get more of this work done? Any thoughts on that? Whichever one of you wants to start.
Yeah, I'll jump in there. I think for our program in particular, being an NGO, and you know, we're kind of just on this constant grind where we're applying for more money, for more grants. So the best way that I think we could get more work done is just having a more steady source of funding, more flexible as well would be nice. But we're kind of on that routine now where you apply for a project, it's a bunch of work, you have 2 years of monitoring built in, and then the future is uncertain and you might lose that site. You might be able to keep it going. But we obviously need that continuity of data set to really make some, you know, make anything out of the data. So I think having more stable funding would allow us to have more continuity of our sites. We'd be able to grow our staff as well. As I mentioned, we're only a handful of people over a large area. But you know, right now we don't want to overcommit and hire a bunch of people when in 2 years' time we might not have the funding to keep them all around. So balancing that, we've also started to go a little bit more down the modeling routes with some partners as well to feed our data into some pretty fancy models that I don't understand. I haven't been built quite yet, but in theory, we're going to have some that take stream flow and builds a relationship between physical measurements in the stream, riffle crest, thalwigs, which is a word everyone loves. But it's basically the deepest part of the pool tail where water dips out into the riffle, the deepest part. So wherever is going to retain water last in the dry season, that depth is a really important number in terms of the connectivity between pools in the stream, as well as fish passage. If it's too shallow, a fish can't squeeze its way through there. Basically, the deeper the riffle crest is, the more oxygen is getting through, so the better the water quality as well. So it's a really critical value. We're going to try to take that and then relate it to stream flow, and then the model will apply that to ungauged streams. So we don't have to go everywhere all the time to measure things. We can at least get an idea of what things look like out there. So yeah, that would help us get a lot more work done.
Yeah, I know. I've been kind of wondering how, you know, advancements in technology and things could help you all try to monitor stuff without having to go out into the, you know, be everywhere physically or set things up in locations. Let's see. Yeah, Pete, do you have any thoughts on this one? How can we get more of this work done? What else would you like to see? What else would CDFW like to see? Anything on that?
You know, just kind of dovetailing with what Troy just said, you know, one thing I think I would put out there And of course, this is again with my regional lens where, we're often looking at really small streams that are potentially going dry. In those settings, relatively small additions of water can make a really big difference. And so, I know if you're looking towards larger rivers, the kind of additions we're talking about wouldn't mean much, but here we're talking about getting dissolved oxygen to levels that will keep, say, endangered coho salmon alive through the summer. And so maybe just kind of the idea that more willing partners or water rights holders that have unused portions of their water available in those tough years, getting engaged and taking on some of those projects voluntarily. And I will say, relatively large efforts were put forth in the Russian River watershed, for example, near where our office is based, to enroll folks and get folks to come forward. But I think there still are some opportunities there. Yeah.
Let's see, before we go on to audience Q&A and talk about beavers, we definitely will. Is there anything else that if you, want to get out there or want to say on this topic? And we can sprinkle that in with audience Q&A too, if we have time. Give you a chance. Okay, are we ready to talk beavers? I've been doing a lot of reading about those. So we've got a question from the audience, and then other folks, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box. This question is, it has been well documented that areas with beaver dams where the stream has been reconnected with the floodplain, that the flow is spread out over the season. It improves habitat for fish and wildlife. What projects are being done in this area? And there's kind of some different things. There's maybe one of you all can explain more about what a beaver dam analog is and why people are putting in those, and kind of the beavers in California and how they help slow it, spread it, sink it, store it, share it, all of that.
Happy to jump in here. Sort of just with a general overview, kind of beaver are increasingly recognized as an agent to quickly reverse bad incision, which we see in a lot of our streams that have been channelized, or the hydrology has been greatly modified and they've just downcut and been disconnected from their floodplains. Beaver can come in and build dams and build up sediment and basically reconnect streams with their floodplains and kind of getting to that slow it, spread it, sink it, have some hydrologic benefits, attenuating flows, maybe some temperature benefits as well with groundwater upwelling. And I would say for the state of California, we're really at the start of seeing these kind of projects coming online. And just from the department lens, we have a beaver program that was just started earlier this year, sort of getting its legs. And but we are simultaneously seeing permitting and grant proposals for projects that would basically do some of this, either beaver mimicry using beaver dam analogs, effectively building what would be like a structure that functions like a beaver dam would in these smaller streams. And so I think it's a really exciting time. It's just at the front edge of what it's going to look like, but I'm really looking forward to kind of seeing where it all goes.
Yeah, and I'll just add that one of the first beaver dam analogs in California. This was done by Scott River Watershed Council. I've got to give them a shout out. Up in Siskiyou County, used the Habitat Restoration and Enhancement Act, and that was created through legislation that we sponsored back in 2014. And they've been implementing a lot of those. And sometimes those BDAs are used to enhance habitat, and then beavers will come in and take over the maintenance, which is great. And then we're also seeing beaver dam analogs used in places where there aren't beavers anywhere near. It may not be until they get relocated there or get there somehow someday. So there's different contexts and places, but we're seeing beaver dam analog projects and that kind of process-based restoration all over the state, which is pretty exciting.
You know, we have a number of different approaches to floodplain restoration. Some where we're seeing banks that are in size 30 feet or more, you know, beaver dam's not going to cut it. And so there's some work to just lay back the banks and create inset floodplain and, you know, that sort of thing where we can, or try to reverse incision where it's starting. And frankly, a lot of that has to do with soil health throughout the watershed. It's really watershed scale. But then also some of the places where we're working are so constrained, such constrained systems, and beavers bring such an element of uncertainty. You don't know where they're going to build their dam or what they're going to flood. And so, you know, there are places where we want to have certainty. And so to some degree, I mean, we're restoring dynamism and it's process-based restoration. But, you know, where we've installed wood or beaver dam analogs to make sure that the flooding happens there, or that wood is caught there and that sediment is sorted in that location. There are times that we want that. Of course, it doesn't come with the element of the beavers, which have their own, you know, value in terms of biodiversity, or just like, you know, your personal connection with them or their intrinsic value. We do see working in some watersheds where there are beavers in some areas, but we're still doing beaver dam analogs in other areas because we know that's where we need floodplain connectivity, and they're just not following our priority plan. So, you know, sometimes we are intervening.
Yeah, that's a great point, Kelix. And yeah, different solutions are needed and techniques in different locations, depending on the site constraints, how incised it is, like, you know, where you're working is going to be very different than, you know, in the Golden Trout Wilderness where, yeah, you cannot bring that machinery. It's not allowed. So they're doing all that by hand, hauling things in, and you just have to go low tech because of where it is. And it's a very different system. So that's something important to point out. Anyone else have any thoughts on, you know, beaver dam analogs, process-based restoration, beavers in general? Is a very fun topic.
Yeah, there's just a lot of enthusiasm, which is, you know, refreshing for a change. It can be a lot of sort of doom and gloom in this field at times. You know, gosh, how are we going to achieve this goal? But now you go to a conference and everyone's talking about BDAs or beavers or how we can bring them back, and it's just kind of exciting. And I'll just say for people who aren't familiar with BDAs, you know, they're generally woven together with small woody debris, and then you might patch the holes with mud or, you know, organic materials like that, but they are still permeable to fish, which is important. Or generally fish can jump over them as well. So even if one of my former colleagues was in the Scott River and was assessing some of those BDAs that you mentioned, and he had pit tags up and downstream, and he thought there were no holes, but he was still finding fish moving back and forth. So they find a way to get through, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, that's a great point. I've also heard Bob Pagliuco at No Restoration Center that say that the beaver taught the fish to jump. That's another thing. But yeah, I remember those studies because there were worries about, is it going to be a fish passage barrier? So they did that research to show, yeah, they can swim on through and go around. I could talk about beavers for forever, but we do have another question. I think this one's for Troy. For anyone, do you make use of data streaming in real time from sensors on equipment, gauges, etc.?
Yeah, so we do telemeter some of our sites. I believe 8 of them are hooked up right now. So it's definitely the minority, and it's I would say not necessarily our prime skill set. It's a lot of kind of electrical engineering to get those up and running. So we have a contractor on staff who helps us with those installs. It is really nice to have to be able to download data remotely, but you know, it comes with its own troubleshooting and challenges and being within cell reception. So there's limits to some of those installs as well. I would love to see more of it, and I'm kind of scheming as well how I can take that data and, you know, make it more readily available to the public. And I've created some sort of online dashboards that so far are still internal that have all of our gauge locations and the telemetered information and things, but trying to make that more public. And but again, mostly that's raw data too, and then there's some amount of manipulation that comes with making heads or tails out of it. So sometimes just having that raw data is not, super useful to the layperson at least. Our gauges aren't necessarily meant to be something like a flood warning system or anything like that. People have asked things like that of us before, but that's not really the role that we're trying to fill. But yeah, exciting stuff, and hopefully more on that to come.
Yeah, I'm seeing another question in the chat that I missed more about, which, yeah, I'm glad someone asked this. What are some other examples of process-based restoration besides beaver dam analogs? So large woody debris installations, chop and drop is another one I've heard about. Maybe setbacks, inset floodplains, berm breaching, etc. So, process-based restoration can look like a lot of different things. So if anyone wants to talk about some of those other examples, I know Trout Unlimited has done a ton of large wood loading projects, and San Mateo RCD also does a lot of this kind of work. But yeah, anyone who wants to talk about this topic.
Happy to offer a couple thoughts on it. I think it's a really great point to emphasize that process-based restoration does not equal beaver. That is one, BDAs and beaver possibly as the agent for building and maintaining dams is one form of it. But really we're looking at, processes restoring things like erosion and deposition created by, wood structures that are, forcing the flow to one side of the channel, reconnecting floodplains. A whole lot of things fall under that umbrella, but I think definitely sometimes it seems that it has become synonymous with beaver and beaver dam analogs. I think the other thing I was just going to say on this topic is that, at least for the department and our regulatory role, depending on what region you're in, how many of these projects you've seen so far, they've certainly kind of caused us to approach permitting a little differently than we have in the past. It's not a standard project, questions about passage, for example, right? These are porous structures, but maybe at first blush, there are concerns about passage or asked or things like that. So I think as we see more of them, it's going to be much more straightforward about how we approach them. But as we've seen a couple in our region so far of sort of the low tech kind of process based approach, and they are different projects. And I think the timing with restoration permitting, emphasis on efficient pathways with these coming online, I think those two will align, and we'll be doing a better job with helping, at least again for the department's role in permitting those kinds of projects.
That kind of gets to what I was saying before, a little bit about how we need to think about multi-benefit as well, multi-benefit projects. I remember one of the earlier floodplain restoration projects that we did. There were a couple of permitting challenges that came up during that. This was incidentally before cutting green tape was a thing. One of them was, if we restore dynamic process, we can't guarantee it's going to be this many inch jump height. If we pave it, we can guarantee that, but then you won't get the ecosystem process benefits. And then another challenge that came up in that was, since there's going to be benefits downstream, it's got flood attenuation benefits, does it count as a restoration project? And we were wetting over 100 acres of land. We were creating 100 acres of wetlands, which certainly has benefits for frogs and snakes and the like in our area. But people were kind of scratching their head about like, well, can we permit this as a restoration project if it's got flood benefits, or some of the funding came from flood intended sources? And then all this, how do you plan for that that dynamism in your permitting? Another one was, we know that the banks are going to settle, which means that for a period of time, the banks are going to be bleeding sediment into the creek. But typically the permits would require that you hold all that sediment back, but we were restoring it to doing what it would otherwise do. So this idea of short-term impacts for long-term benefits, or uncertain outcomes to have the benefits of dynamism, are things that I think still need to be navigated in our permitting systems. I don't know, Pete, would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're really at the the front edge of figuring out some of these things, and I really am excited that we have the tools to think about them a little differently. And I think the second part of that is that the multi-benefit side of these projects is really one we're scratching our heads over how to approach still. And I think beyond, kind of coastal streams, as we move into the Delta, a lot of restoration projects really, almost by requirement, they're multi-benefit and at a much bigger scale. And I think that's an avenue for cutting the green tape like approaches to kind of grow and develop. And statewide restoration general order, some of the federal permitting tools really coming together there. And yeah, definitely would agree with you on that.
I feel hopeful because not only are we developing new tools and ways of thinking that we can stand on the shoulders of these previous efforts, but also because it feels like there's a lot of inclination right now and a lot of conversation towards figuring that out. So I feel hopeful that that's the next, the next phase.
All great points. Let's see. There's another beaver related question about how historic presence affects maybe people's embrace of reintroduction of beavers and BDAs. I will just say also, if you want to read more about the beaver situation, CDFW now has a whole page about it and a beaver restoration program you can look up. And also Occidental Arts and Ecology Center has a lot of information about that on their website. I mean, my thoughts on the beaver thing is it's all very site location specific. And you've got to, so that's my initial thoughts on that as far as, beaver reintroduction, BDAs. But if anyone else wants to say anything about that.
I think the question that's being asked here has another element of it also, which is how does whether or not they were historically present in an area affect how people are embracing their reintroduction or BDAs? I can answer part of this from my own perspective. And I am so not going to get into the debate about whether or not there were beavers in this area, but I can say how that information would affect us. The BDAs themselves, to me, it doesn't really matter whether or not beavers were present, because the BDAs are an engineered design that will have the outcome that we want to accomplish the objectives that we're talking about here. So we know that that creeks have become incised and that floodplains have become disconnected, and that is one approach to reconnecting them. So that doesn't matter to us about particularly whether or not there were beavers. They're not actual beaver dams, they're analogs. But then we don't do reintroduction of species, so I can just glibly sidestep the other aspect of your question, Chris, and punt to Pete.
And I will defer to our wildlife program, who's not here with us today on that side of it. But I will just on the science side and just sort of the historical setting, I will say that there are some useful analyses and tools that speak to whether or not a particular segment of stream would even be suitable, and do give a bit of an overlay of kind of the human conflict dimensions of that, and that does give us sort of at least a starting point for a conversation, perhaps. So hopefully, kind of seeing some guided approaches towards this as we get further down that line.
Yeah, and it looks like Hannah put in the chat a link to the CDFW website, so they can people can check that out and stay up to date on what is happening there. To kind of wrap, seems like we're ready to wrap things up. Okay, Chris just said thanks. Is there any final? I'll give you a chance to give any final thoughts you have. You all have on this whole topic. Maybe we'll start with Pete. We'll go in reverse order from the beginning.
I really just kind of reiterate that I really think we're in an exciting time with just approaching these projects differently in terms of the types of projects, how we're permitting them, funding opportunities. And I personally feel really grateful that I'm actually able to be part of all that on the department side. So just kind of looking forward to seeing where this is all going to go.
for that. And Troy, any kind of takeaways, final thoughts before we go?
I mean, I guess it's kind of just similar. Yeah, it's gratifying to be, part of a community where there's so many people doing so much great work, and sometimes it makes your head spin all the different, details you can get lost in. And luckily, my job is generally pretty straightforward, the monitoring part, but there's so much, you can do with it and so many directions you can go. But I'm just glad there are so many agencies out there putting in the good work, and yeah, the endless list of partners we have is really exciting. And yeah, just being, younger in my career probably than sorry, the people on the call, but it's just great to have this network going forward. And I know I can, lean on a lot of these people in the years to come, and hopefully we'll achieve some great things.
Thanks, Troy. I know. And if anyone at Sustainable Conservation wonders why I have like 400 tabs open in my browser, it's because there's so many things to read about all the time, including, many pages about different projects that people around the state and at both your organizations are doing. And I want to learn about it all. Kellex, final thoughts, takeaways to leave us with?
Yeah, well, clearly Troy is 17. But other than that, my takeaways, I think one thing I agree with Pete about this being like an exciting time, and sort of what Troy was saying as well. I also think I just want to just say out loud that this work is really hard. It's really difficult, and I think that we need to be kind to each other about it. It can be it's just kind of playing whack-a-mole with all the different challenges that come up on these projects, and we all know they're important. And so I think that being kind to each other, and also if we can all just row in the same direction to make these projects easier, whatever part anybody touches, whether you're an environmental advocate, a funder, a project manager, or whatever it is, if we can all just own a piece of making it easier to get critical work done, I feel like that will really help. So that's just an invitation for everybody who's here.
I think that's a great way to close it. So thank you very much, Kellex, Troy, and Pete, for being with us today and sharing all of your thoughts, wisdom. We really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and now you'll want to go learn a lot more about these kinds of projects and read about the work that all these groups are doing. The next webinar in this series will be announced soon, but it'll be in early December. So we'll announce that in the next few weeks. And if you'd like to follow Sustainable Conservation's work, please find us on social media, subscribe to our email list, or consider a donation. All new and increased donations are currently being matched dollar for dollar. So now is a great time to support by visiting suscon.org/give or scanning the QR code on your screen. And thanks again for joining, and we hope to see you at the next webinar. Have a wonderful day.